We continue now at the top of Daf Beizam and Beizam Mesechet Nedarim. This is Nedarim Daf Tube. The Gemara says, Kol kinuye Nedarim Nedarim. It says all substitute languages of Nedarim are the same as Nedarim. Ma'ishna gabe Nazir. What's the difference that by Nazir, meaning in Mesechet Nazir, the lokatani luhu lakulu, it doesn't have all these examples. All it says is Kol kinuye Nazirus, but it doesn't say any other examples. It doesn't say Kol kinuye Nedarim, Kol kinuye Shavuos. It only says Nazirus. Ma'ishna gabe Nedarim. And what's the difference by our Mishnah and Nedarim? The Katani Lakula, that it says all these different examples. It talks about Nedarim and Shvuos and Charamim. And so the Gemara answers, Mishum the Neder u'Shvua ksivi gabe hadadi. The reason is because Neder and Shvua in the Torah, they're written right next to each other. It says, Kol Neder v'chol Shavuas Isser. And so therefore, since they're written next to each other, so Tani Tartan, so we teach both of those in our Mishnah. The Kevan, the Tani Tartan, and once we teach the two of those, Tani Lakulu. So then we just learn all of the various examples. And the Gemara asks, V'lisni kinoi Shavuos basar Nedarim. So why don't we learn Shavuos right after Nedarim? If they're right next to each other in the Torah, why aren't they right next to each other in the Mishnah? And the Gemara answers, Aidi detan Nedarim de mitzar chefza aleh. Once we have Nedarim there, and that has to do with the object being usher to the person. So Tana nami charamim de mitzar chefza aleh. So we also teach the language of cherem, which is also a concept of the object is usher to the person. The difference between Nedarim and charamim again is that Nedarim is like a carbon. That's something that goes in the mizbeach. We're comparing this object to a carbon. By cherem, we're comparing the object to a cherem. That's also something that's donated to the Beis HaMikdash, but it's not necessarily a carbon. So those things are similar. La'afuke shavua, now that's different than shvua. To ka'asar nafshe min chefza, because by a shvua, the isser is not going on the object, the isser is going to the person. For him, this object is going to be prohibited. And the Mefarish over here says, the mitzar chefza, the chiyomar davar ze olai bekarban o becherim. If a person says, this item is to me like a carbon or a cherem, so asar le lechefetz olav, he's putting a prohibition on the chefetz. Umishamachi tani lu badi adadi, that's why they're taught together. Aval kiyomar shvua shelo ochel davar zeh. When a person says a shvua, the language is he's taking a shvua not to eat this particular thing. O she'eni nena mi davar zeh, a shvua not to benefit from this particular thing. So iulo asar lechefetz olav, he's not putting the prohibition on the item. Elanav she asar meu chefetz. What he's saying is that he is prohibited. He's taking a shvua not to eat that particular item, and therefore that is listed separately. And the Gemara continues, Pasach b'kinuyin. The Mishnah starts off talking about kinuyin, these substitute languages, called kinuye nedarim. It says called kinuye nedarim. Umefarish yados, and then the Mishnah goes on to explain a totally different concept, which is yados, where you don't say the whole phrase, you just say part of the phrase. Ha'omer l'chaveru mudar ani mimcha. It says if a person says to his friend, I'm going to have a neder from you. And the Mefarish over here says, Pasach v'kinoi Mefarish yados la'alter. Right away it says yados. Mudar ani mimcha, dahainu yados. That's a case of yados. U'lechatchila havalei l'maslis and Mefarish kinuyin kagon konem v'hadulis yados. First, the Mishnah should have explained itself better and explained that the language of konem, that would be an example of a kinoi of the word carbon. First explain that, and then you should explain the concept of yados, where you say part of the phrase. And the Gemara continues, V'su, and further, yados inchi. It seems like yados has been totally forgotten. And the Mefarish says, V'su akati. We can ask further, Yados inshi hechi shacham atana. Where did the Tana forget about them? The lokatani v'yados nedarim kenedarim. You left out the line which it should have said, which is that Yados of nedarim are nedarim. So why didn't it explain itself fully? And so the Gemara answers, Ayri Beho, and the Mefarish says, Ayri Behu devade lo shachachlu. It's not forgotten liyados. V'chisure mechsra. It's just that there are words missing in the Mishnah, and it should be read as follows. V'chisure mechsra v'hachi katani. There are words missing in the Mishnah, and it should be read as follows. Kol kinuyin nedarim kenedarim, v'yados nedarim kenedarim. The Mishnah should read the kinuyim of nedarim are like nedarim, and the yados of nedarim are nedarim. But the Gemara still says, V'lifresh kinuyin b'reisha, but why not explain kinuyin first? First we list off this whole idea of kinuye nedarim are like nedarim, yados nedarim are like nedarim, but then we only give an example of yados. And the Gemara says, Ahu desalik minei ahu mefarish b'reisha. The Mishnah likes to explain the one that it left off with last. So the last thing mentioned was that yados nedarim are like nedarim, so that's the one we explain first. And the Gemara says there are other examples of this. Kiritnan, like we learned in the Mishnah, B'ameh madlikin uv'amah ein madlikin. It starts off with B'ameh madlikin, then it says ein madlikin, and then we explain the ein madlikin. B'ameh tomnin uv'amah ein tomnin ein tomnin. The same thing over there. It starts B'ameh tomnin, then it says B'ameh ein tomnin, and we explain the ein tomnin. B'ameh yisha yotza uv'amah ein yotza lo seitze isha. What can't a woman go out with? Talking about on Shabbos, and then it explains lo seitze isha, even though the first thing in the Mishnah was B'ameh yisha yotza. And the Gemara continues 1 second. But is that really true? Is it really true that anything that they start off with in a Mishnah they don't explain first? We have examples the other way. We learned in a Mishnah, it says there are some who inherit and then they give to others to inherit, some inherit and they don't give to others to inherit, and it explains the first thing in the Mishnah. So there's an example the other way. Mutaras that's another example where we explain the first line in the Mishnah. And another example, yesh te'unos shemen u'levona, shemen velo levona, some need shemen and levona, some need shemen and not levona, ve'elu te'unos shemen u'levona, and then the Mishnah goes on to explain first the shemen u'levona, which was the first thing in the list. Yesh te'unos hagasha ve'ein te'unos tenufa, tenufa velo hagasha, some need to be brought close and don't need to be waived, some need to be waived and don't need to be brought close, ve'elu te'unos hagasha, and the following need hagasha. Again, all examples of situations where we're explaining the first thing first. And the Gemara brings a final example, yesh bechor lenachala ve'ein bechor lekohen. Sometimes it's a bechor as far as inheritance, but not as far as kohen. Bechor lekohen ve'ein bechor lenachala. Sometimes it's a bechor as far as kohen, but not as far as nachala. And the Mishnah explains the first thing first. Ve'ezeu bechor lenachala ve'ein bechor lekohen. What's an example of bechor lenachala and not bechor lekohen? So in other words, you see situations where we do explain the first thing first. And the Gemara answers, halin, in these cases, mishum da'av shulei, because there are many different categories. It's not just two categories in these Mishnayos. So mefarish ahud the pasach bereisha. So that's why we explain the first thing first. But the Gemara continues, but what about the situation of an animal? Talking about on Shabbos, what it can go out with and what it can't go out with. That there are not many categories. And it says that the camel goes out, and we are explaining the first thing first, and we'll continue with this discussion in the next video on Daf Gimel Amud Aleph.